today I'm going to talk about translating cognitive science into practice. I'll briefly introduce the review that Terry mentions. I think Terry has very helpfully highlighted something here, that if we think of cognitive science as a list of strategies that we can just do in our classroom, and I understand this, I used to teach. I was in primary and secondary schools for just over 5 years. And I know how I would have wanted is just give me something I can do tomorrow, give me something I can use. I want the strategy, I want the thing I can do. And that is often really helpful. But what we're finding with cognitive science is that there's a layer before that where we try and understand some of the principles which sit behind those strategies. It makes them more portable. When we understand the principles behind them, we can use them in different areas of the curriculum. We can use them in different ways. It makes them flexible. And it underpins a kind of intelligent practice and an intelligent adaptation of them. So the principles are important, but also further down the line, I'm in the conversations I'm having with teachers, school leaders, policymakers, other organisations, realising that to do cognitive science really well is about really connecting it with lots of other things that we know are important. It's connecting it with teaching practice, it's connecting it with school leadership, the curriculum, CPD, lots of other things. And this is where I Terry mentioned jigsaws, and it's a way of saying that to do translation of cognitive science really well, it's like building a jigsaw of different things. So I'm going to talk about what those things I think are in that jigsaw based on the conversations I've had over the years. So I'm going to try and hopefully find some slides if the technology is going to play with me here. And in a second, a nice purple screen should land about now. Can everyone see a translating cognitive science research into practice front page? Fantastic.
Yes, that's great. Thanks.
Super. So so this is another introduction to me. So yes, I'm Tom. I'm an associate professor at the University of Warwick in England. I actually was at the University of Birmingham when I completed the EES Cognitive Science Review. I'll talk about that more in a moment. I've got my Twitter handle and email address there, and I'm honestly really happy to be contacted, and people send me questions and comments and everything all the time, and I do really appreciate that. Just a little bit about me. I'm actually not a cognitive scientist. I describe myself as something like applied educational social science. But essentially, it's just about how can we take all this research, this evidence, this data, and use it to improve policy and practice. And in doing that, I've got a couple of strands of what I do. I have this thing which I sort of maybe pompously put under methodology, which is about actually how do we go about getting research into practice? How do we get evidence and data into practice? What does that look like? And there's all these tools to do that, things like systematic reviews or evaluation and inquiry work are all kind of methods for trying to work with things in applied settings. So I've been working really hard on just how do we do that really well. I teach a lot of research methods. If you come to the University of Warwick and do a master's degree or a doctorate, I will inflict an awful lot of research methods on you, and this is kind of part of that. But then I'm also really interested in substantive topics where this connection between research, policy and practice is important. So things like professional development, around accountability, especially with data, but this one in the middle, applied cognitive science, is just this really, really important case study right now for me of how do we get all this valuable information we have in research and make it work in policy and practice. So that's the kind of substantive area that I work in. So I'll share these slides afterwards. There's various things you can click on if you're interested, and there's a book and various other bits and pieces. Pretty much everything in this slide is open access, and you sort of see the range of work that I'm doing right now. So today, the focus is on translation. My main aim is to just set out a description of how translation works and what the main elements are needed within it to make it effective. As I say, based on conversations I've had over the last few years and research that I've done. And broadly, the journey that we're going to take looks like this. I'm going to start just with a starting point by talking about the difference between basic research and applied research, and then move on to a thorny problem of context. Classrooms are messy environments. There's lots of contextual things that happen in them. What happens when cognitive science hits all these things? Then I'm, as I've sort of indicated, going to talk about the value of having good principles to work with, and talk about what I see as jigsaw thinking and why that's helpful. And then finally, I'm going to finish about, well, how do we develop this kind of expertise? What does that look like? So, let's start with the review. So back in 2021, so a few years ago now, I was leading a large systematic review for the Education Endowment Foundation. So at this point in time, there's a huge interest in cognitive science, certainly in England, but internationally as well. And there was lots of cognitive science finding its way into classrooms, into professional development courses, all this kind of stuff. But there was a question about how much of this research has been tested out in real classrooms, in everyday conditions with real teachers. We knew that a lot of the research was laboratory based, a lot of it was highly controlled. Even when it was in the classroom, we had, a PhD student delivering the lesson, or a scripted lesson, or things like that, which as far as it doesn't sit well with teachers. They want, but will this work in my classroom? Teachers were saying. So the EEF commissioned this review. It was a pretty big team, and we basically asked the question, what does the research say? Should we trust it? And it's this little phrase, in the classroom. We want realistic conditions. We want it in classroom settings. What does that actually look like? And that's what we jumped into. As I say, my main aim here is not to go into the details of the report, the review. I'm just trying to sketch out the kind of things we were looking at. A lot of this will be familiar, and it will certainly become more familiar as you progress in this particular professional development program as well. But the kind of things we looked at were spaced learning, interleaving, retrieval practice, cognitive load, something we called working with schemas, which was, I think other people called generative learning. That's another more common phrase for it. We had a section on sort of dual coding, but we put it slightly more broadly than that and talked about the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So what's all these kind of different modes and mediums and, everything in terms of different forms of information, as it were, that you can use. We looked a bit about embodied learning, and we looked at strategies that deliberately put lots of things together. And there were 8 areas, there were 14 strategies. We did a big systematic review. We also had this really rich conversation with teachers. We did interviews. We were going to do case studies, but COVID decided to get in the way. So we couldn't land in any real classrooms, but we went through everything that's been said and written by, teachers that we could find. And the big kind of message from all of this, in fact, there's 2, was just that this cognitive science thing that everyone's excited about, it matters. Teachers should know about this. This is really, really helpful stuff. We're on the right lines. This is a really, really fruitful place to be. This basic science that we've got about how the memory works is super helpful, and we should be really putting this into everything that in classrooms. It's not the only thing. It's not. Of course, it's also actually very overlapping with things that we already knew anyway. But nonetheless, this is not going to go away in 10 or 20 years. This is a really helpful science of learning that is useful. And the second finding, and it sounds slightly contradictory, but the applied evidence is actually rather limited, and the picture is far more complicated and far less positive, to the point of having lots of non-results. And I think one of the things that people have struggled with slightly from the review is that both of these things are true. They'll say, well, what are you saying? Is this cognitive science thing any good or not? And it's like, no, but both of these things are true. What we're seeing is there's lots of promise from cognitive science, and sometimes it's being realized, but there's a massive gap at the moment between the kind of effects, the kind of value that we see in the basic science, but what we're actually able to implement, what we're actually doing in classrooms and in policy. And so many attempts of crossing this theory to practice gap just have failed. And it was interesting with the review because it lands in a really politicized environment. And after one of the talks I gave, initially after releasing it, I'm not sure if anyone remembers this. Years ago now, there was this meme that floated around of this dress, and some people saw gold and white on the dress, and some people saw blue and black on the dress, and people were arguing about, is this dress, is it a gold and white, or is it a blue and black dress? And it just depending on what light it's in, as this little picture illustrates. But someone came up to me after one of my lectures on this report and said, your report, it's just like that dress. Some people see finding number 1 and say, yeah, cognitive science is brilliant, we should be doing it, it's fantastic. And some people see finding 2 and they say, yeah, I knew it, there's no evidence, we need to abandon this. And I had to keep repeating this message that no, both of these are true. And so this is sort of preamble to saying, well, okay, so where do we go from here? And just to reinforce the point now about what these findings say, is that we've got a really massive body of evidence on the basic science. It's fundamental. It tells you about how your memory works, how your attention works, and how learning works. And we have a really, really huge evidence base on that. But the applied cognitive science is where we put it in realistic conditions. We put it with real teachers in real classrooms, real curriculums, and we try it out and we see if it improves students' learning. We have a huge amount of evidence for the first. We have a really small and weak evidence base on the second. That's exactly what's being saying here. And in terms of what's that meant for policy and practice at the moment, is we have a lot of this going on, that we've got really smart teachers, researchers, policymakers, everyone, school leaders, who are taking some of the insights of basic cognitive science and trying to put them directly into practice. And so they should be, but not necessarily having this middle layer of, here's a tested program that we've got working, here's some really good practical experimental work, which is going to help with that. So there's some really pioneering and important work going on, including with a learner's toolkit here. It's exactly the frontier that we've got at the moment of taking some of these principles, putting them in practice, and hopefully we can fill in this middle layer at some point and get the sort of practice on it. And just one final thing to say on this is just, this is not new. This is, I'll give you a few seconds if you want to read this quote, and if you'd like to check the date as well as you do. So the language is slightly academic here, I suppose, but it's that with cognitive psychology hasn't actually taken the messiness of classroom environments very seriously. There's been too much controlled experiments, too much lab work. We haven't thought about variables that are ecologically important. Think of the ecology of the classroom and all the things that are happening in it. And we've got a bit of a blind spot there, and this is from Nisa, writing sort of 50 years ago now, and I could write exactly the same sentence right now about where we are with some of the evidence base. And so I suppose what this has meant for me is that this is a blind spot of research right now, but this blind spot of research is the task of educators, because we haven't tried this out in realistic classroom conditions, and because researchers haven't got there and maybe they never could. It's the job of school leaders and teachers to do these experiments and to try this out and to make it work. So it's these blind spots of research are kind of a limitation of it, but it's, as I say, that it's now a time for the profession to pick up the baton and put the stuff into practice. So that's what I've taken from that. So hence why I'm sitting here talking about translation, and hence why I've had this conversation for a few years. So translation. Let me just try to unpack some of the problem here as we've seen it. So in the Cognitive Science Review and the accompanying report, one of the things we did as a team was just look through all the papers that we could and just looked at anything that might affect the result. Like, what are the things that make retrieval practice work in one classroom but not another one? What are the practice which makes it work for one child but not another? What kind of thing is there? Now, this is I'm deliberately creating excess cognitive load here, and just to throw a very big table of lots of things at you. It's quite a long list. You suddenly realise, well, it depends on this, and it depends on that, and it depends on this, and it depends on that, and hang on. And this is all stuff that we've pulled out of the literature in terms of something like retrieval practice. Will it work or not? Well, it depends on, and it's all this stuff in this table. And you should glance your eyes around this. There's a section at the top left about teachers. It depends on the teacher, what they're doing, their expertise, their enthusiasm, their motivation is everything. It depends on the pupils, their background, everything from whether they've had a drink of water that morning to things like age and maturity and background knowledge. It depends on the classroom environment. Is it neat? Is it tidy? Is it disrupted? Is it noisy? Does it have resources around it? Is it an emotionally safe space? Bottom right, it's about the activity, it's the topic. Is it maths? Is it science? Is it art? Is it English? What topic? What information's there? What's the content of the curriculum here, and how complex is it? So you get a really, really big mess here. And then people say, well, it's really messy, isn't it? It's really messy. And how do we make sense of that? So let me have a go. Let me try and make sense of that. How can we make sense of this messiness and what we need to pay attention to and what we don't? So the first thing to notice is that research often lands in an abstract place. It's general principles, abstract notions, whereas what's happening in your classroom is really concrete. It's a very immediate thing in front of you. And teachers and researchers tend to be actually working in different directions. So what we've got in the research at the moment is really, I'll just put the first two for now. In the research, we've got the stuff which is most abstract. I can pretty confidently give you lots of evidence which says retrieval practice works, just as an example, or cognitive load, worked examples or something. That's where the evidence is right now. And as you start making it, that's a really abstract principle here. As you start making it more specific and saying, no, how about, does it work in art? Does it work in English in different subjects? Does it work for early years? Does it work for older children? Does it work for adults? Does it work at different age range, in different conditions, in different sectors? As you start moving into, how about specific activities here that you might do in a classroom? How about specific learning objectives, types of content? Or how about the specific conditions? Does it matter if it's a trainee teacher in the room? Does it matter if pupils have a lot of prior knowledge or not? As you get more specific, and right at the bottom here, it's, my year 4 maths lesson here, or it's this specific moment in this specific classroom where this child's looking slightly confused at me when I've asked them this question. Like, what level of abstract to concrete? And as I say, researchers are working upwards and teachers are working downwards. And one of the things we need to see about translation is that we need to go as high as we can in the list where the evidence is, and then we need to carry the thing through the remaining steps, as it were. So we can go back to the evidence and say, right, there's some really good evidence that it works in this subject, retrieval practice works, this is what it is. There's a little bit of evidence on different activities and what's more effective and what's not. But some of the remaining steps, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, needs to be carried through by teachers. So this is one way of making sense of some of this complexity, that it's about making things concrete. It's about making them specific. And I mean, if you're interested, I did some work with the Chartered College of Teaching in England. There was a big teacher exercise where teachers asked lots of questions about cognitive science that they had, and they compiled all these questions essentially. And then teachers did action research projects. They did work on this. There's a link just on the slide, and it was, here are some research project priorities from teachers. And if I jump back to the previous slide, teachers' priorities were kind of 3 to 7 sort of space in this middle for their research. Well, as I say, a lot of the academic research sits a little bit above that. So that's a helpful way of moving us down this continuum. Right. So moving ahead, I'm going to look at this kind of link we've got between principles, practices, and implementation. And I don't actually intend to spend too long on the principles and practices. I think that's something best done in a kind of dedicated space. I will talk a little bit about what I mean to give concrete examples here, but I'm going to focus more on this last one of implementation, talking about jigsaws, talking about professional development. So, but I just want to give you a sense of what I mean. If I could put this in a sentence, it's something like this. It's that to do cognitive science translation really well, teachers need a good set of principles, working principles that they know about how learning works. A few principles, and some of these are related to practice. I'll give you some examples in a moment. Some of these related to cognitive load, some of these, related to embodied learning, this kind of thing. You need a set of principles, but you also need to have connected that to a set of practices. And so it's things like classroom activities or strategies that you can use. Classroom dialogue, it's the things that you say and do and put in front of children to help them learn. And similarly, where students are using cognitive science informed techniques, they will need to some extent a set of principles and a set of tools and activities and practices to be able to do that. So yeah, a learner's toolkit is an example of both of these being sort of connected together. It's the principles and the practices. And then even if you've got great principles, you've really got the cognitive science understanding, you've got loads of practices that you can use, it still doesn't follow that this is going to work. And that's where I'm going to focus on the jigsaws and implementation. But let me give you a sense of what I mean by principles and practices first. So some of the key things. So this is a slightly potted version of some of the things I pick out. So when I've talked to teachers, I've said there's a few things you need to know about practice in the sense of rehearsal, not in the sense of classroom practice. I mean, just in terms of when we learn things, we have to learn them for the first instance, and then we have to rehearse them, we have to practice them, we have to revise them, we have to recap them, we have to do something with that learning. It has to be active learning, it has to be over a period of time. And a few principles I pick out are things, some of this might be very familiar, is that first of all, we're always forgetting things. When we learn something for the first time, a day later, students have lost half of it already. A week later, they can barely remember what you did. A month later, you've lost it. And this is just the most disconcerting and frustrating thing for any teacher, because we've all been there. We've had a class, it's gone really well, they've all got it, and you've got all these kind of nodding heads and brilliant exercise books with these students who've really, really got it, and you think, brilliant, they've learnt this. And it's really disconcerting to think, if I do nothing now, they won't be able to remember this next week. And again, I've been there, like that following week, where you say, hey everyone, can you remember what we did last week? And you get lots of blank faces, and then you say, oh, but we did this, you had it. And then you're going back and saying, no, we learned this, why have you forgotten it? But this is exactly how our memory is set up to do. It's meant to forget everything. You're not meant to remember what you had for breakfast a week ago. It's meant to be dropping things. So we have to build this into our conception of how we teach. We have to teach something for the first time in first presentation. Cognitive scientists call this encoding. You get this information, you encode it, you get it there, and at the end of that lesson, right, they can say it, they can repeat it back to you, they've got some good work in their exercise book, they've got it. But then the process of learning is then you have to keep coming back to it, and there has to be a way of continually engaging with something over time. And each time you come back to it, it comes back to you quicker. So when you do it that next week, it doesn't take an hour to learn it, it takes 10 minutes to recap it. And in 2 weeks' time, it just takes 5 minutes to recap it. So it's quicker each time, but you've got to keep refreshing it. You've got to keep coming back to it. So that's a really important principle. And if we look at our curriculum and say, are we doing this? I've got to be honest, like I look at my own teaching and I think, you know what, there are some things which my students, both university students and primary school children, and I think farther enough back, I've just looked at once and I've just forgot about, and they haven't encountered it again. And they haven't encountered it for another 12 months until they hit the same topic in the spiral curriculum next year. And that's a problem because they just won't have remembered anything and you're just playing catch up. The second real important principle here, as I say, apologies for going slightly quickly over these, is just that testing your memory is far better than representing something to it. We have all these studies where on one hand, you've got a group of students who are told to reread a passage or rewatch a video or something, and another group of students who are told to test themselves on it first. And counterintuitively, I think, the ones who test themselves learn more than the ones who reread the passage. And again, this is about testing. It's this idea that your memory is designed to forget things, and it's trying to solve a problem, really, of, put it this way, my memory is trying to figure out what it needs to hang on to. It's trying to forget everything it doesn't need, and it's trying to hang on to the stuff that I need for the future. So how does it do that? Well, it does that by every time you ask something of it and you say, can you remember this? It's a little marker to your memory to say, hang on to this, you need this. Let me give you a really concrete example. If I were to create a new password for some login on the computer, and I wrote my password down on I grab myself a post-it note and I write down the password, and think of two strategies. Strategy one is I write down the password on my post-it note and I just pop it next to my computer. This is fantastic data security. It's exactly what my IT services would recommend. Put my password just above my computer and it's right there. And then strategy two, I write my password on the post-it note, but I put my post-it note face down on my table and I ignore it. In the first strategy, every time I need my password, I look up and there's the information. My brain doesn't need that information because it's right there in front of me. I can just look at it each time. The second strategy, every time I need my password, I think, what was my password again? And I try and retrieve it. And if I can remember it, great. And if I can't remember it, I look at the post-it note and remind myself. I'm telling you from the kind of learning science that second strategy is so much better for getting that into your head, that password. The first strategy is almost teaching your memory that it doesn't need to know that password because there it is in the environment. And then again, I think back to my old classroom and I had all these working walls with posters and key vocab and everything all around my walls. And every time my children wanted to write something or do something, they just looked up at the wall and hey, there it was. And now I think that was really silly because I should have covered up those walls and said, can you remember? Can you remember what word we were using? Can you remember that concept? Can you remember that lesson from last week? And by providing that information, we weren't testing it. So this is a really important principle, and it's a real shocking one. As I mean, I found this very contradictory to a lot of things that I had done in the past. Right, I'll move a bit more quickly because I do want to get onto jigsaws and implementation, but hopefully you're getting an idea of the kind of principles here, which once you've got in your head that you need to sustain learning, you need to keep revisiting, you need to make sure that you're testing over time and retrieving information. As soon as you have those principles, that's a really powerful tool for thinking about whether the learning is effective. Another one in the area of practice is around spacing, that we spread out learning over time. Another one, it's far better to do 15 minutes 4 times than it is an hour at once. So you want to learn your times tables, do 10 minutes a day, don't do an hour all at once. Interleaving, we can sort of mix up different things. It's a mix-it strategy from Learner's Toolkit. This is, again, a really powerful principle. So that's what I'd pick out as principles of practice. And there's a very fantastic paper by Rodiger on benefits of testing. I think testing is their friend. This big T word has been very terrifying, and accountability systems have just beaten us to death with tests, and it's been very damaging in some cases. But actually testing is our friend, and there's a really great book I can recommend from Christian Still, who's a deputy head in the south of England, on test enhanced learning, and it's all about how testing is learning. It's part of learning, it's part of the learning process, and there's a million different ways that, not high stakes, not threatening, it's building it into how we do teaching is really important, and it's a really helpful set of ideas there. And then I have this conversation, again, I'm just giving examples for kind of concreteness here. When I then say, okay, you've got these principles, now what does that look like in terms of activities, in terms of practice? And teachers say they're doing these kind of things. They're using knowledge organizers, retrieval grids, quizzes, labeling diagrams, they're using flashcards. These are the kind of practical classroom level strategies that turn those principles into something that you can do. And these are the kind of things you can do tomorrow, and you can get a resource pack and sort of put some of this stuff in place. And as I say, I'm not going to focus much on these. Teachers also talk to me about how they organize retrieval. So how do they get it in their curriculum planning? How do they know how to prioritize different things? And it's things like, how do they build into their homework? They have exit tickets from the classroom where before children leave, they have to post it in a box or something. And they've got different ways of organizing it as well. So there's a set of practices, there's a set of ways of organizing this practically, putting it into plans and routines in classrooms, and that's all really important. Okay, so I'm sort of conscious of time here, so I'm just going to do this terrible thing of just sort of flicking through a few slides just so you get an impression here. But there's a whole set of similar ideas here for cognitive load. We could stand here and talk about the principles of memory. You might have seen a diagram like this, and you can say, hey, here's how your attention works. Here's short-term memory, long-term memories. Here's how we forget things. Here's how we encode things. We've got senses. We've got a limited working memory. It's a bottleneck. Those are the kind of principles that you're working with here. Long-term memory is, pretty much infinite capacity, and this is how your memory works. And again, you can leave this kind of conversation thinking, I'm getting cognitive load wrong in my classroom, and attention is really important for how this works. There's some really good principles in here which are really helpful for people, and optimizing cognitive load is part of that. In the same space, there's another set of principles around dual coding and how we can use pictures and words essentially and not create cognitive load by putting them together. It's a really helpful thing. So again, there's a really useful set of principles here. I put a link at the bottom of this slide where there's some really good resources and information about this, and it's something to explore. And then again, similarly, you've got some principles. then it's like, what does that look like in practice? So here's just a short list of things that teachers will say, well, what does that look like? Well, I activate prior learning, I tailor my lessons, I do pre-learning, and I do chunking, I do direct attention, I avoid split attention, I do scaffolds and guidance and worked examples, and I fade, and it's this kind of stuff. That's what I mean when I say practice. These are practical classroom strategies that you can do. In generative learning, it's things like asking children to elaborate, reorganize, recall, redraw, give partial examples, summarize. All this kind of stuff is absolutely brilliant for generating understanding. And this is the kind of bread and butter of classroom practice here, which makes this happen. So this is where I've been leading to, really, that I suppose you could, maybe a year or two ago, I might have stopped this lecture right here and say, great, so this is what we need to do. We learn the principles, we figure out what that looks like in practice, and we go away and have a go. And if we work at this in 6 months, in a couple of years, we work together, we'll have this, and it'll be really, really helpful. And I suppose where I've slightly been disappointed in some of that is sort of seeing some of the problems that emerge from that. And this is why I'm starting to talk about jigsaws. This is why I think translation is still something that needs attention. So let me just give you two concepts. One is the jigsaws, and the other one is about sort of differentiated CPD, which I think are important parts of this picture here. So let me start with a quotation. I absolutely love this quotation. I'll show it to everyone who will listen. I'll give you a few seconds if you want to read this. So this school leader has just brought together, in an interview, it was just a really nagging suspicion that, hang on, there's a problem here. And this school leader just put their finger on it. And she just explained this really, really well, that she was supporting her staff in her school to get retrieval practice across the curriculum. And she realizes that, you go into art and you're just not sure what retrieval practice looks like anymore. And there's a couple of things in here which I'm going to pick out now. The first, which I'll come back to in a second, is the subject-specific thing. I think subjects and curriculum content is really, really important. And I think the big division happens between your science and technology on one hand and your arts and humanities on the other. And I think there's a really big difference there in terms of what cognitive science looks like, depending on whether you're kind of sciencey, technically mathsy kind of end of things, or the arty humanity end of things. I think there's a real difference there. So I'm going to come back to subjects in a moment. But the thing that got me thinking about jigsaws was this top phrase, the purity of the research. And then this conversation follows on, and I've had similar conversations where you say, what do you mean by purity of the research? And a lot of teachers will say, well, there's this thing that, it works because the research has sort of found it works. And so there's this thing that definitely works. And I must be getting it wrong somewhere on the way between the research and it being in my classroom, that I've lost something, it's become tarnished or impure somehow, or people talk about lethal mutations. So lethal mutation, I've changed something and it's just killed this strategy. It just doesn't work anymore. I've made a mistake. And my response to that has been, well, when I think of research, I don't think of it as being this complete thing. I don't think of it as having all these answers. And we think about this abstract down to concrete continuum here. I see research as just providing a very generalized, very abstract principles, sometimes a few strategies, but it hasn't done the work of going through the detail of what it looks like. So I would say research is incomplete. It's limited, it's abstract, it's uncertain, it's helpful, but it's only a small part of the picture. And you can see how this moves me on to thinking about jigsaw. So it's all, maybe it's less about taking something which is complete and just putting it into practice without messing it up. And maybe it's more about taking the thing from research and connecting it with other things. And so I followed that line of conversation and asked people what they do. And again, I won't read through these things, and I can link the article here, but I wrote a piece about what we don't know about cognitive science, and I was talking to some teachers at this point, and I was asking them just how they do retrieval practice. Tell me how you do retrieval practice. Is it what are the challenges? What does it look like? How does that go? And when they talk, they sometimes talk about retrieval practice itself, but a lot of talk about retrieval practice and how to do it well seems to be about how it fits into the very crowded curriculum, or how they manage the emotions and enthusiasm of the children, or how they manage the classroom routines, or how they manage their timing or their spacing, or there's all this kind of stuff which is not really to do with retrieval practice, but to do with classroom practice more generally. And so you keep going this conversation, and I think, well, the teachers who are doing this really, really well are teachers who just connected this up to everything else they know about their practice and their curriculum and their subjects. And it's a process of sort of piecing things together that's happening here. So here's the metaphor here, that the teachers who I've spoken to who are really doing retrieval practice and been doing it for years, or worked examples, cognitive load, whatever it happens to be, or just any other practice, they're not talking about, oh, I've got this thing from research and I've really, really understood it and I've just made sure I did it perfectly, like a blueprint, like you're building the house from a good blueprint in situ. The teachers who really, had been doing this for years were talking about how they pieced everything together. And this is how I think we should be thinking about cognitive science. It's that lovely red jigsaw piece here that's being placed in. It's a set of principles, and the way to move forward with that is not to ask, how do I do this properly without messing it up? The question is, how do I fit this into my curriculum? How do I fit this with my classroom? How do I fit this with my teaching style? How do I fit this with this? And it's piecing it together. So following that line of and just sort of boiling some of the things down here. So this is me sort of trying to condense conversations with teachers. I think if you did a research project where you sat down and said, tell me how you implement this particular strategy, I think it's like a bingo card almost. Like teachers might mention any one of these things. And if you read what Sarah Cottingham wrote in the paper that Terry mentioned as well, when she engages with things like retrieval practice, she'll say, yes, and it's about how I manage my classroom environment. It's about my classroom talk and dialogue. It's about how I differentiate. It's how I do my formative assessment. It's all this other stuff that she talks about. So I think that's the kind of consideration for it. So one way of sort of thinking this through is just to say, and again, we don't have time right here, but it's a useful conversation to say, think of what we know about retrieval practice. How is homework helping? And then you can say, okay, homework is a way of extending the learning. It's a way of keeping that going. And then pick another one. When it comes to retrieval practice, how does that link to workload? And then teachers can say, you know what, I found it really, really hard to assemble all of these quizzes and find all of this information. So I've been drawing on this resource and I've been keeping my workload efficient and making this feasible for me. Or you say, okay, well, how does retrieval practice link to your classroom talk? And they'll say things like, well, actually, I found myself, I said this on a podcast a few weeks ago, what one teacher told me about, they like to be forgetful on purpose. They'll say, oh, can anyone remember what we did last week? Oh, I can't remember. Prizes for who can remember what we did. Or they'll stop mid-sentence and say, oh, yes, so the big idea that we were learning last week was, and they'll wait and they'll say, okay, get the answer to that in your head. And they'll stop. And they were saying, you know what, I'm doing retrieval practice there. I'm getting kids to remember stuff, and that's what I'm doing. And again, like, it's not really about retrieval practice there. It's a bit about more classroom dialogue and how they talk to their children. So I'm rambling slightly, so I'll stop there. But you can see my point. You can say, you can put any strategy, you can put it next to other parts of classroom practice, and you can ask how this is fitting together. So where I want to end today, and we'll hopefully have sort of 5 minutes for maybe more for questions, but I think this is another important part of it, is just to think about how we develop that kind of expertise. I've talked about these teachers who've been doing this for years and years and been really practicing, and they've got this really advanced way of talking about how it all fits together. How do we get to that point? What does that look like? So one of the things we know about professional development is that it's really, really important to connect what we know to a particular subject area, particular curriculum content. It's not that the CPD has to always be just about maths CPD or specific in the first place. It's that there needs to be an opportunity to contextualize what you do following the CPD. So we can sit and have a very generic discussion of pedagogy, and we could be sat here, we could be primary practitioners, secondary practitioners, and we could all have that discussion usefully. But there does need to be a bit where it then gets, okay, well, what does this look like in my subject? What does this look like for this particular curriculum content? It's what's sometimes called the distinction between pedagogical knowledge, like the strategies, content knowledge, which is knowing your subject, and the pedagogical content knowledge of being able to put them together. It's not just teaching fractions. Sorry, it's not just knowing about fractions, it's knowing how to teach fractions. It's putting the teaching next to the content. So that's really, really important. And it makes me a little bit worried, again, back to the basic science here. One of the things we were talking about following the review is where the coverage was on the evidence. So we looked at whether the evidence was matched to different age ranges and different subject areas. And what you're looking at here, the strategies in this diagram, I'll try and get a little pointer, here we are down the left. These are our 14 strategies that we reviewed. And then here's an age column and here's a subjects column. And I've just coloured in green the ones where we had really good coverage. So spacing, you can relax with spacing because it's been done at every age range and every subject. It's looking like a really solid strategy wherever you are. But when you get out of that, there are these blue areas where there's a lot of maths and science going on. There's lots of key stage 3, which is about sort of 11 to 14-year-olds. There's a lot of kind of, there's some early years stuff over here. There's lots of these cold spots. So it's really hard to say, well, what does this look like in different subjects? Because at the moment, that hasn't been tested. And we did touch on this in the review. We were talking about some of the reasons why cognitive science didn't quite make it. And a lot of it actually didn't seem to be about anything wrong with the cognitive science and nothing wrong with the principles and sometimes nothing wrong with the practices, but just the CPD didn't go with it. We had, put it this way, good cognitive science, bad CPD, no effect. That's the simplest way of sort of boiling it down. And you start reading some of these reports. This is a really big study, this Davenport study. They spent millions and millions of pounds on this massive randomized control trial. It's absolutely huge. I think it's one from the US. And you spend millions and millions of pounds trying to get something working. And then when the results come in, you get a null result. That's really annoying. And the discussion sections of these research papers become really, really interesting because they're sort of soul searching about, well, why didn't it work? It really should have. We did everything right. And often what they come to is, well, because the CPD wasn't there. And so this quote here is about, someone kind of wrestling with some of these ideas. Practitioners are struggling to, comment in the chat. Yes, CPD, sorry, continuous professional development. So anything beyond initial training. Sorry, yes, it's a lingo thing, isn't it? So practitioners are struggling to interpret and integrate these abstract principles. They haven't got those strategies down, or they have to integrate, this is, jigsaws, have to integrate a variety of learning principles in a complex dynamic system. So they're sort of describing this kind of, actually, it's giving practitioners the space and support to able to do that. And here's just another example. So this Yang study, it's again a really big study, really helpful, but a really disappointing result. And they're saying, look, these teachers would have benefited if the professional development gave them direct experience with the learning environments that they need to produce. So as in the CPD, teachers can pretend to be the learners themselves, as it were, and rehearse the kind of learning environment they need to produce. And then they get into their own classroom and they have a chance to put that in practice, and they can experiment with that and they can try and make it work and embed it. It's not just carrying over the principles, it's about producing a learning environment. And that's a really tricky thing. So how do we do good CPD, professional development? I won't go there, but there's some, I'm going to recommend 2 reports here. There's a really, there's lots of great reports and research papers on this, but a couple of favourites of mine. There's one from the Teacher Development Trust. There's a set of principles there which are helpful, and there's another one which the EEF has produced as well. I think these are really nice reports. They've got summary sections as well, so you can or find or produce a one-pager of some of these. The final idea I just want to finish on, though, because I think this is another part of it, is I start asking and seeing whether, essentially the question is, do trainee teachers need something different to early career teachers, to experienced teachers? Should I be having the same conversation with a practitioner who's been in the classroom for 20 years as someone who's just started out their teaching career? And I think the answer is yes. And one way I've been trying to understand that and figure out what the difference is there's this, it's a kind of classic model of professional learning. It's not just teaching. I mean, I think some of the original research was done with pilots and, you know, accountants and stuff. It's all over the place. But there's this kind of general idea that as we develop expertise and we move from being a novice to an expert in a particular area, there's a general move from rules and sort of rehearsed, sort of simple but rehearsed approaches to something which is far more fluid and creative and something which is judgment in the moment. And that's the kind of general feel of some of these. And I think that's what that's leading me to, is to say that where we have a trainee teacher, we want to give them a tried and tested classroom strategy. We need to then ask them to directly implement that. And it's like almost a rule-based, I'm going to start my lesson with a quiz, and I'm going to do that every week. And I think as we move through kind of levels of expertise, it starts to become far more open and starts to become more creative in terms of what happens. So I found this a really useful framework to look at. If I just, as I say, pick out what that looks like. This model suggests that novices need rules. They need plans. They need to plan their lessons. They need set resources. They can't be too fluid and thinking in the moment too much. They have to just implement things, and they're not really making judgments in the moment. As we move forward through that, you can start to so the advanced beginners are starting to get more perception of the classroom dynamics. They're not just implementing the plan thoughtlessly. They're starting to realize when to stop the lesson, when to change things, when to edit things. As you hit this point of competence, so hopefully where most teachers will be or beyond, is that you're starting to have perceptions of how you've got your routines embedded, but you're starting to have a perception of how what you do now might in fact impact something in future. So you realize that that retrieval quiz here is going to affect where they are later in the lesson. You realize that the lesson before is going to impact the lesson after it. You start realizing that that puzzled look over in the corner of your room might derail your lesson in about 15 minutes time. You're starting to make connections between where you are now and the goals, and you start being able to shape your lesson as a result. Proficient teachers start to see a more holistic view of the situation. So if we put a really expert teacher into a classroom, I can guarantee you they'll hone straight in on something that's important. They've got all this mess, there's 100 things going on, and they'll immediately go, we've got a misconception over here. We've got these kids aren't engaged. They'll be able to hone in on what's important. And what I'm saying is that's a really important skill that novices don't have. Experts can take a complex situation and somehow just zoom in on the thing that matters and the thing that they need to pay their attention to. And they can, when they become experts, do that in real time. So as a really general description there, I think, and I'm going to bring this now to cognitive science, just a few quotes here. There's Dreyfus talking about rules are like training wheels on your bike. You put the rules in place, you learn to ride your bike, and at some point you take those training wheels off. And so our kind of rigid ways of implementing cognitive science are good for novices, but I really don't think they're helpful as we progress through our practice. They're a good starting point. And of course, we could be an expert in one thing and a novice in another. So I'm not saying that we all fit into one of these boxes. And again, this is Dreyfus talking about expert systems, and judgment is never as good as experts. There's no complicated rule book for teaching. There's no technical manual. There's no way of stopping in your lesson and looking up the next thing to do. You have to be making judgments in action. And that development of that judgment and that reflection is really part of how we move cognitive science forward. So in terms of practical exercise, I'll stop here. But just to say, this is the conversation I've then had with teachers to bring this to cognitive science. So the first conversation is this. I say, look, here are all these strategies. We've just talked about, lots of these, and I'll say, tell me which of these do you think is the easiest and which one's the hardest? Which ones have you struggled with? Which ones did you just get? And think about your school as well. When you implement this in your school, did everybody just get spaced, learning, just like that. And then other people really struggle with cognitive load. Thinking about which are the easiest and which are the hardest is one way into thinking, well, some of these require a bit more expertise to be able to do well. And then related, I say, okay, well, let's start thinking about the things that we want to change in our classrooms, the things we want to change in our school, and let's try and sort them almost. Let's try and sort them into the rules and the quick tricks and the things that you can do tomorrow. Let's try and think about those things that we're going to work on over this term and we're going to slowly get better at. And let's think of these persistent and thorny problems, which we're just going to be working on for the rest of our career, and trying to start to differentiate how we implement cognitive science into these things is a really, really helpful way. And thinking about how different people at different stages in their career will need different things. So I have left 5 minutes for questions. I've probably talked at too great a length here, but hopefully that's been a useful tour of translation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if anyone has comments or questions, I'm very happy to stay.
Thank
Awesome.
you so much.
You go, Vic.
No, I was just going to say, Tom, I've taken so many notes. I was just wondering if everyone in the meeting would like to unmute. And as we have Tom here, you don't want to hear from Terry and me. Use this opportunity. Ask any question, and no question's a silly question. So let's go for it.
I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Tom. It was lovely to hear from you, and I hate to imagine what the time is there. But as you're speaking, I'm just really thinking about what do you think is the role of the student actually understanding their, what's happening in their brain? Where does that fit in with what you've spoken about?
Okay, I think it's really important. I think what we know is that there's a big body of literature and what we call metacognition. So what we see from the best learners is that they are purposeful in how they work with the information they have in front of them. And not only are they purposeful, so they think, I need to make sense of this, I need to find out this, I need to do this. And they're also good at self-assessment. So they know not just what they know, but they know what they don't know, and they know where the gaps are, and they'll know essentially when they're confused or something doesn't make sense or it looks new. What we see in, and this is what we really need to foster as teachers, I think we're more in self-assessment routines than cognitive science potentially, but I mean these are the same thing to some extent. So what I'm saying is, when you give, let's say, a mind map activity where you have to sort of, put your knowledge out there, it's explaining the purpose of that and why it helps move their learning forward is a really helpful thing. And the greater extent that students can own that and know, I am doing this note-taking exercise, I am doing this mind map, I'm doing this because I'm trying to organize my thoughts, I'm trying to identify the gaps, I'm trying to find the retrieval practice. Those principles, I think, matter for students. And then it's helping them do that, though, by us as the teacher giving them self-assessment and purpose clarification prompts and saying that, why are we doing this mind map? I mean, you can tell them, we're making this mind map at the start, but you can stop your exercise. It's just as valuable to do the metacognitive thing as to do the substantive thing. So you give, let's say students have to make a mind map, you tell them why they're doing it, and they go off and doing it. And then the temptation as a teacher is to stop them after 15 minutes and say, right, let's all share how we're getting on, what have you got in your mind map? And you talk about the substance and what's on it. But it's just as valuable as a teacher to say, tell me how you're finding this mind map. Do you remember why we're doing this? And do you remember we're trying to do this retrieval practice thing with this mind map? Has anyone found some things that they couldn't remember? Has anyone done this? That kind of scaffolding from us gets passed on to them, and then we have independent learners who are good at self-assessment and good at metacognition. So I think that's really, really important and very helpful. Oh, and it's only 10 o'clock here, or 11 o'clock, so don't worry about me. I'm wide awake. The other thing to say is just, and I know because we're sort of pressed for time, is that if at some point, during the next week or whatever, you want to just collate a set of questions, I mean, I'm really, really happy just to write a short response to each of those and send it back to you. That might be one way of doing it, but
sure. So
Yep. Okay.
you go,
Sorry,
Dr.
Terry.
King. You go, Dr. King.
Sorry, Terry. Tom, thank you. This is great to listen to. I keep asking Terry to write a textbook. I guess my question is, why do we write textbooks without all of these wonderful things in them? And why don't we have accompanying workbooks? Or will that happen with the advent of computers and AI and the ability to generate things spontaneously?
Yes, well, yeah, I agree. Terry, Vicky, please write a textbook. That'd be fantastic. And good textbooks, I find, it's not just the information, but it's this metacognitive stuff. It's like a little box saying, check your knowledge, and a little box saying, have you thought about this, and can you remember this, and here's a link for more. It's this interactive stuff. And again, this is kind of one of the gaps here that we often have. So a lot of things around implementation, we talk about mobilization of knowledge. So, it's all very well to have these principles of memory, but it often helps for teachers to especially trainee teachers. So if we're working with colleagues who are less experienced than ourselves, it's helpful to have a reflection sheet. It's helpful to have a checklist. It's helpful to have a resource that's embodied. Some of the mixed strategy programs we looked at, some of the more promising ones, it was not just, do this. It was, we've developed a cognitive science curriculum along with textbooks and exercises and everything. We've developed a toolkit. We've developed this. It's building these classroom tools, which is a way of embodying some of these principles into a tool that, whether you understand it or not, you can still use effectively, I think.
I think one of the interesting things is working with the full range that you've been talking about, the novice through to the expert, and how they use those tools. And the situational perception that you've been talking about, Tom, when you're working alongside or thinking about translation, is actually trying to work out where yourself is or where the person that you're working with is on that Dreyfus model of expertise, and then working out how to, apply some of these principles that you've been talking about, or where they're already applied in practice as well. And I think that was something I was going to ask. A lot of what you've been talking about, teachers, particularly those who've been teaching a while, are doing quite naturally. And how important do you think it is to sort of bring to the surface the science of learning technical language, or does that not really matter? I
get why many teachers will say, I mean, the phrase which I've had thrown at me a few times is old wine in new bottles. This is the, we've had quite a bit of this. This practice thing, I used to call it consolidation. Oh yes. Nonetheless, I think there are some differences there. I think there are actually some, not just, sometimes sharper and sometimes different concepts here when we do compare. And I remember going through your classic educational theory of it's Vygotsky and it's Piaget and whatever else, and there are important differences here. And I think I do think actually though that does limit the value for really expert teachers. It also, when we know about expert teachers, to some extent they have to unlearn a bit of practice in order to move it forward, and that's hard. And also I think it's about recognizing those advanced ends, and this is why again this novice to expert thing's helpful, because it'd be really insulting to take a really great teacher and say, hey, retrieval practice, do a 10-minute quiz at the start of every lesson, because they would say, well, that's way behind what I'm doing already. Where if you say, actually, what does advanced retrieval practice look like? That's something they can engage with. And the other thing I think is that we've actually got a thing about having a common language in the profession. A lot of school leaders have said, you know what, I'm actually doing a lot of this stuff already. There was definitely stuff I've learned, but actually I just find this really, really useful when having a conversation with my colleagues. I find this really useful when I'm inducting new teachers. Some of this language is just helpful for getting us all on the same page and sharpening this up. So I do think that's, if we could just make one more comment, just what's occurred to me as well here, is just that I think one of the other dangers I see, and maybe I could have a whole section on it, but is there's a bit of putting the cart before the horse in terms of doing strategies. There's a lot of people like whether it's students, whether it's teachers saying, I'm doing X, Y, Z, I can do what I'm doing. And there's a list of strategies that they do. But one of the things I'm trying to do with that Dreyfus model is say that essentially every teacher is on a learning journey from what their current practice is to how we can move it forward and what that looks like, what that journey looks like. But I would say this also applies to self, like people using a learner's toolkit and moving themselves forward. They need to know, well, what's the journey I'm on in this topic area? Am I a novice? Where am I? Am I somewhere in the middle? How do I move myself forward? And same with teachers, same with students. And what that means is, I think, am I doing retrieval practice or worked examples or whatever? Am I doing these well is sometimes the wrong question. The right question is more, where is this learner at the moment? And what's the next appropriate step to move them forward? Because if they don't understand something yet, you need to teach it. And cognitive load and worked examples and modeling becomes really helpful. If they've already understood it, the next step is about retrieval. If they've retrieved it and they've got a really developed understanding already, the next step is generative learning. But the point is situating what does this learner need now to move them on the next step of their journey. And then only then do we know which tool in the toolkit to reach for in order to make that next step. Whereas, am I doing retrieval practice well? Sometimes gets teachers just doing retrieval practice left, right and centre, even though the children, they might just need some a bit more at the basic end of just introducing material to them.
Yep, that's great. Thanks.
Awesome. So thank you, Tom. What I'm going to do really quickly is talk about the homework that everyone in this group is going to be doing over the next 2 weeks. So the reason why we've developed this course is in conversations with Tom and Sarah and Mark for a number of years, the biggest thing that we're really emphasizing is the need to get greater understanding of what it looks like to take these things, and the toolkit's a good example because they're just a collection of things, and the utility of those things as they're applied to the classroom setting. And what's really interesting is that we had very spirited conversation. Dr. King might have been in it earlier this year, where we're our maths teachers. We instituted this strategy of a quick review, which is, I learned this when I started teaching 20 plus years ago. And it was a question from yesterday, last week, and a month ago. And the whole idea is, yes, that quick review does retrieval, it does spacing, and it does interleaving. But what was really interesting was that the difference in how teachers with differing layers of expertise were using that strategy became quite illuminating and slightly stark in terms of our loss of sight in the fact that they were just using it as a strategy to then start their lesson, but they weren't really contemplating, one, how they designed it, two, what they learned from it, and then three, how it then linked to the next phase, how it linked to how they taught the particular material, how they shaped their work examples, how they then differentiated the work examples with their class. So it became a bit of a blunt tool from a point of view, oh yes, we're at our school doing a quick review where I look at my work and, yep, this is what we did yesterday, last week, and a month ago. And they became so repetitious in its use. They actually just saw it as a phase of their lesson that was disconnected then from the substantive phase and so on and so on. They just saw it as a thing that you did. And then once we did it, we just moved on to the next thing. And we started to talk about how, well, really, the more expert teachers in the room said, oh, what I generally do is I would then pick stuff that might not necessarily be last week or a month ago, but might be the foundational knowledge from which we're going to build today's lesson upon. So I need for my students to retrieve those things that are going to be the foundation of which we're going to build today. And sometimes if they've forgotten it, well, rather than just applying more weight of more content on a flimsy foundation, it would give me the opportunity to go back and start to and attack, say, misconceptions or common errors or misunderstandings and so forth. And I guess what it sort of showed us is that if we just talk about strategies in isolation of practice, then we actually are doing a pretty poor job. And that sort of was a bit of feedback pill that we needed to accept, or I needed to accept, from a perspective that we just thought that you just train teachers to use these strategies and then magic will occur.